Okay, we're officially live now. So, yeah, as I was telling you off air, I think this discussion has been long overdue. I mean, again, like I told you off air, you had some videos done on me in the past, but I just didn't respond to them. But what prompted an interest in this specific conversation was just the exchange you had between yourself and Jesus as Lord, and then the subject of abortion came up. So I wanted to talk about some of the things you guys discussed, and then perhaps just segue into a general conversation about abortion.
Sure.
So I guess to start off, just lay out your general position on the issue. Like, where do you stand? Because you already know where I stand, but
Yeah.
just lay out for the audience where you stand.
So my general position is that I would love to preserve all human life, but that's not a realistic goal. I think as a society, at least here in America, that we, to some degree, consider on the surface that all human life is sacrosanct, and to the point that we would make laws preventing the manipulation of human embryonic cells or the harvesting of said cells because of this idea that somehow human cells are above mouse cells or above other cells, while of course we're moving to try and accomplish a goal here with having medical interventions for humans, but at the same time we're restricting the use of them. So it's a bit paradoxical in that sense. But one of the things that I find most interesting is the fervor over the topic of, well, what rights do women or couples have when it comes to their reproduction, when on two grounds I kind of have a bit of an issue. The first one is, it just seems odd to me that as a society who values military, values war, and would readily bomb other countries, uh, the the disregard for human life in that aspect is a stark contrast to the pleas for preserving human life here on this ground, on this surface in America. The second one is, I could say, more along the lines of, I don't want to set a precedent for any type of legislation to start restricting or regulating human reproductive rights, because that's a slippery slope. The second you give a governing body the choice to say, well, or removing the choice to say, well, you know what, we're going to decide when it's appropriate for you to reproduce and how, that opens a door for a number of things that I don't feel comfortable with. So even though I typically will be a more left-leaning voter, I am fully aware of how the government's overreach can actually have an impact on the freedoms and the rights of other citizens. And so this is one of the areas where I stand firm to prevent the government from overreaching and possibly having more power than it should over the lives of individual citizens.
Cool, cool. So, how do you define reproductive rights? Because we got to be careful when we're having these conversations to like define our terms succinctly, so as to be on the same page, and also to treat each other with respect and charitability and not strawman each other's positions. So how do you define reproductive rights?
That's a good question. So for reproductive rights, the rights for individual citizens to make choices on how they are to how they will go about reproducing. So if a woman decides to carry her fetus to term, as opposed to a woman who decides to terminate pregnancy, within the first 4 to 10 weeks, each woman has the right to choose one or the other, instead of being coerced by the government, or excuse me, being forced by a government or laws to choose for them. And so basically having that option is their right, in a sense.
So is would you say then it's fair to say that your position would be stated in other words, like it's not just merely the fact that she gets pregnant, but she have any and all available choices to her to do what she pleases with those, if that's not too vague?
It's not too vague. It's just, the only thing I would clean up is that the choices uh, concerning what she does with that potential fetus or with the zygote or what have you, are along the lines of what is, let's see, desirable in the face of making decisions about their life. So if they have a decision to make as far as, like I said, bringing that zygote to term, then they can choose an elective surgery, or they can choose to, if they want to donate the cells to medical science, then they have the right to choose to. They don't have to be forced to, donate those cells, so on and so forth.
Okay, cool. So, um, I think me and the vast majority of pro-lifers will say that we wholeheartedly support reproductive rights in the context that we do believe women should have choices to, how they handle things in their bodies, and whatever health options they want to pursue, they should very well have access to those options. The only thing we would be against is one specific choice, and in the context of this conversation, that's abortion. So, would you say that pro-lifers being against that one choice would necessarily mean they're against reproductive rights in general?
I would have to say that that's what it seems to be, because if you're about people having the right to choose, you can't say that and then take away their option to choose. I could say, well, my son has the option, whatever option he wants of ice cream, and I take away every other flavor but vanilla. Well, I've effectively allowed him to only choose what I want him to choose.
Right. And I think that presumes that we think something like abortion should be an option. And where I'm getting with that is, let's take this example. I believe in parental rights. Like, if a mother has a baby, let's say, she's a single mother and she has her child, right? She has the option to either parent the child herself, or to give her child up to someone else in either a closed or open adoption, or going to what they call safe haven location. Have you heard of those?
I have heard those scenarios. I'm not familiar with anyone, at least in my personal life, who's opted to do that, but I know that the option does exist.
Right. For the benefit of those who may not know, safe haven locations are locations, and I think this is the case in all 50 states. I have to check for that for certainty, but I know for a fact that at least most states offer this, if not all of them. Basically, within the first 30 days after a mother has a baby, she can go to like a clinic, a hospital, a police station, a location that's specified in the law, to where she can give her baby up to those authorities and not be prosecuted within
Hmm.
the first 30 days.
Louisiana
So,
has quite a few of those facilities. Actually, there's actually billboards on the side of the road which designate several, and they'll tell you when you're about to pass one, so that it is a viable option. Of course, being a Catholic state, they're very, very pro-life. So I believe a lot of the places also. I'm trying to remember one of the main places. Firehouse. There we go. That's what I was thinking of. Firehouse was another one of the places. So yeah, this is very, at least in Louisiana, is very, very prevalent.
sure. So, in that context, there's a few options there, and I support all those choices, whether she parents the child herself, or whether she gives up for adoption or takes it to a safe haven location. I support all those options, but an option I don't think should be on the table in a parental rights context is her having the option just to kill her baby. So what I'm saying is, um, if you had a scenario to where uh, it became legal for even people to kill their newborn children, I don't think that's a choice that should be factored into something like parental rights. If I'm against that, that doesn't mean I'm against parental rights. I just think that should not even be a choice. So what I'm getting at is I'm against one choice when we talk about the reproductive context. I don't think that should even be a choice, and I don't see how me being against that means I'm against uh, reproductive rights in general. I just don't think she should have the choice to terminate her baby.
Well, if you're saying that you are for her right, then the right to choose also means having the option to choose things that you don't like. I mean, people have the options to choose lots of things that I don't like, but I can't say that I am for their right while only supporting their right to do the things that I find pleasing. I think that's kind of the issue here.
Well, there's a difference between things that we don't like and things that are that should be morally impermissible, regardless of whether we like them or not. Like, for example, uh, I may not like the way someone's raising their kid, but I mean that's a totally different issue than if they just wanted to just just I don't know, just stab their baby to death or something. Like that's
I think
not factored into whether I like it or not. That's just something that is a totally different category. It's not a fact of me liking it or disliking it. It's just something that we don't morally permit. So I think when you frame it in the terms of like or dislike, you have to make the case that abortion is in those same sorts of terms in that same context.
so. I think that we should clear up some terms. A zygote is not a baby. A fetus is not a baby. There's a reason we have these different categories, because a potential fetus and a potential baby are not the same thing. An apple is not an orchard, an apple tree. So when we're talking about the stabbing of babies being akin to the aborting of fetal tissue, they are completely different. Uh, as far as their rights and as far as their developmental growth and their, I guess, consideration and far that stage in development are vastly different. The cells that I work with on a day-to-day basis come from a human source, but they're not life. So there's a
Well,
bit of a difference here.
Well, I would disagree with that. And if you give me a second, I actually have a list of sources from scientific sources. These are not from pro life websites or anything similar to that, but there's a number of scientific sources that would specifically say that the unborn entity is a baby. So I don't agree with your characterization that the unborn is not a baby when there's a ton of science resources that'll say the exact opposite.
So there you have scientific sources that refer to 4-week-old fetal tissue as baby.
Or just the unborn entity in general. I mean, it doesn't really matter what stage of development and the woman we're talking about.
Hmm. I mean, I find that that's probably the case. They probably do refer to it as a baby in hopes that it will ultimately become a fetus and then will ultimately be born, which is fine. I mean, it's if we're talking the semantics that I'm talking about here is just to kind of put things in the context, because stabbing a baby that is out of the womb, and the abortion of fetal tissue are kind of different, just a little bit. The purpose of me drawing that comparison is to point out and to highlight that when we're talking about the act of an abortion, the act of stabbing a child, not just the mechanical difference, but just that the actual baby does have personhood. Fetal tissue, unfortunately, does not have personhood, legal personhood, which is a bit different than the moral aspect that you had brought up earlier. But from a legal standpoint, we can work with embryonic tissue. If there was some type of sacrosanct status of fetal tissue, then I wouldn't have access to embryonic kidney cells that I have access to right now.
I mean, well, technically, we're all made of tissue, whether you're talking about a fetus in the early gestational stages or whether, you're talking about us right now having a conversation. You're just talking about a different category of tissue, just at a less developed state.
Well, the tissue is quite different. Embryonic tissue is vastly different than the tissue that we have. And when I mean vastly different, we can induce our cells here to kind of, I guess you could say, regress to the progenitor stage where they could differentiate to different cells. But they don't do this perfectly. They actually, go aberrant at some point. because it's a forceful process. But when you have embryonic stem cells, well, that's the best one because they can differentiate into almost any other tissue. They have a special status, and that's why I drew that comparison, because embryonic cells are the best to work with because you don't have to make them pluripotent. You don't have to induce them, and they don't go aberrant like embryonic cells will. So there is a vastly like biomechanical difference, excuse me, a biochemical difference with those types of cells.
Well, I find it very interesting that didn't you like not point out earlier that we try to make humans like some special category or something, as opposed to other species, and, try to make the human context more sacred than others. Is that not what you said earlier?
Yeah, one of the things that I was highlighting there was that we try to pretend as though human life is somehow sacred, which sure, if that's what people want to believe, but the interesting thing is that how our society also encourages war, encourages the death penalty. Like life is not actually as sacred as people like to claim, and that was just one of my. It's kind of more of an aside that I found interesting when we talk about this whole topic, and also the fact that I am actually able to work with embryonic stem cells. Yeah,
Sure,
stem cells right now is
sure.
another testament.
Now, if human life is not sacred, or you think, to say that human life is sacred is based on flawed premises, then why would you suggest that there's some sort of whatever inherent or external difference between a baby and, let's say, a fetus at 6 weeks gestational stage? Like, why would there be some sort of difference, inherent difference at all, if
Oh,
human life is not sacred?
Oh no, don't get me wrong. The difference lies in the biochemistry and then the actual tissue itself. Like there's I could just pick, let's say, the telomerase, for instance. Then in a fetus, you have active telomerase. You don't have that in babies, and of course, toddlers and adolescents and adults. They don't have that type of activity. So there's a biochemical reason I say that. It's not just based on, well, I think that this tissue is different than this tissue because it's less mature. No, there's an actual difference like between them.
Well, I mean, that just suggests just the function of the tissue. Like, for example, a 6 week fetus in the womb doesn't like have a consciousness like humans, like us, like we do. So it seems all you're really doing is just saying that you point to the early stages and look how the tissue functions, and using that as some sort of argumental difference.
It is a difference. It's not the same as the actual baby that you were referencing in your stabbing scenario. Like babies, after probably age 2, they're not subject to randomly dying. With the exception of SIDS, you have the kind of the problem of this tissue that's possibly viable spontaneously dying. You don't really see that in actual babies. Like I said, outside of the SIDS range. So there are a number of differences when you actually look at a potential fetus or even a zygote. So even you could just say even a zygote to a fetus, there are major differences as far as their viability and as far as how those tissues actually could possibly result in an actual human being born.
But what I'm getting at is, if there's no um, sacredality, if that's even a word, if there's no sacredality in human beings, then why in the world would any differences between a newborn baby and a 6 month fetus matter?
Well, I'm not sure how differences between something would make something not sacred or not. You could have something that's purely sacred. It's like there's different religions that are sacred that are vastly different than one another. I'm not sure I really get your point there.
Well, I'm just saying that you seem to say on at least a general level that humans are not really sacred, but for some reason you make a distinction, with the later stages, like, consciousness develops, or the ability to think and things like this, you know, it seems like you categorize those in a separate category. But,
Yes.
ultimately humans aren't really sacred at all, but you're treating as if, these ability to think and act in these ways is somehow uh, a sort of a valued context rather than a 6 week fetus.
Oh,
Like,
don't
why do
get me
you
wrong.
place?
It's not a value thing. It is the fact that I understand the developmental differences between these different tissues as far as its developmental stages. Like that's it has nothing to do with. I guess maybe I should make an illustration. I look at life laterally. I don't look at them tiered. I think human life is the same as dog life, as the same as cat life, as whale life. I don't think that humans are necessarily even though we are an apex species and that and an ecological standpoint, sure, but as far as the value of our life, we're just the same as any other conscious being. So when we're talking about the developmental stages of whatever organism, there are stark differences between them, and that's why they're at those stages. So me pointing out the developmental differences that are recorded, very, very, very detailed in fields of embryology and biochemistry. That's just me stating facts. I mean, it has little to do with my personal perception. That's just how things are.
Well, do you have any children?
I do.
And would you put those into the same context as like whales or something?
Sure. The value of my son's life is no to me. I could say, yeah, I personally value that from an evolutionary standpoint. I kind of have to. I don't even if I tried to say, you know what, my son is worth less than this dog. You know, that's not going to happen. I am geared over millions of years of evolution to value his life more. But in the essence of it, if if I say, you know what, I am okay with bombing this particular country, I'm okay with this guy receiving the death penalty. I don't think that life is sacrosanct. If I did, I wouldn't have those positions. But just because I personally value this one life does not mean that overall my position is somehow consistent, you know? But I can't put it, and I've said this before, I can't put a value on my son's life. That means nothing. My son has to give his own life value.
Well, that's interesting. You say that he has to put value on his own life, but it seems that you're doing the exact opposite. Like when you look at a fetus in the womb, like you seem to think, way that there's no sort of way that you can just let that entity develop, and then later on, they give their own life whatever value they choose.
Well,
So,
I mean, the part of the issue here is that being an autonomous entity and being a parasite are kind of different. Uh, Technically, a zygote and a fetus are parasites, so it's hard to give them that bit of autonomy there when they don't actually possess it at that stage.
well, if you're going to say that the unborn is a parasite, since when were parasites of the same species?
No, they have parasitic birds. There are different classifications of parasites. Some of them are commensalless. Some of them are obligate parasites where they actually harm the host. There's like 4 or 5 different variations of, or I should say, permutations of what a parasite actually is.
Well, specifically, when you're talking about parasites, parasites generally in nature rely on their host for life,
That
right?
those are ones that are obligate parasites
Right.
that actually do harm. That's one of the classifications of parasites. And in our case, uh, the fetus would be more. I can't say it's a commensurate because it actually does take nutrients from the mother. So, yeah, it would be actually. Huh. I have to. There's another classification I can't think of right now where the there's neither party benefits or gains anything. One party gains and the other loses. And there's I can't remember that other classification, but yeah, it's the fetus actually takes nutrients from the host, which is the mother. So by a basic definition, yeah,
Well,
yeah,
that would
they
mean
are.
that pregnancy in general would be defined as a parasitic relationship then,
It
right?
is. Yeah, it actually is.
Well, what can you reference me any scientific sources out there that categorizes pregnancy as a parasitic relationship?
Sure. Let me see.
Because I've never seen any scientific source out there say that pregnancy is defined as a parasitic relationship.
Parasite reduces the fitness of the host. Let's see. There's all kind of blogs on this.
Yeah, I'm not convinced by blogs. I want to like see like reputable scientific references.
That's fine. I'd have to give that to you later. This is actually something that my instructor was saying just last week. He's actually done work on embryo implantation, and one of the things that he was laughing about is that, yeah, technically it's a parasitic relationship.
Well, yeah, I've never heard of any parasitologist refer to pregnancy as a parasitic relationship ever. So that's kind of weird that anybody would say that. I've not seen one reference on it, and I've went out of my way to look for such a reference and have not found one ever.
So there we go. That was the other one. So it's symbiosis, the close relationship between any two organisms. There are three basic types of symbiosis: mutualism, commensalism, and parasitism. Okay. So you have mutualism, where both organisms benefit. Commensalism, yeah, where neither are harmed, neither benefit, and then parasitism, where one benefits and the other doesn't. So how about this? How about I actually just send an email to my instructor, and I could give you his information, and
Sure.
then he can, yeah, I can do that.
Sure, that'd be great. But I guess let me since we got that out the way, so when do you how long do you think abortion let me ask you this instead. Are there any circumstances do you think abortion should not be permissible in?
Late-term abortions are ones that I have a problem with, as the viability of the actual fetus has gone up considerably. So within, oh man, let's say probably the last 8 to like the 9th month, even actually before that, I should say like maybe 7.5, I have kind of an issue with, just because of the viability. So yeah, those kind of I'm definitely not in favor of it. I know that they happen for whatever reason, other than some dramatic medical. Like, I'll give you a perfect example. A lot of people don't know that my cousin actually died about a month ago, giving birth. If there was a chance for her to perform a late-term abortion in order to save her life, I'd be fully for it, because I want my cousin. But that's selfish of me. That's purely selfish of me. The fetus was delivered, and it is a healthy child, but I lost my cousin. So I'm pretty sure that's what she would have wanted. It's not about what I want. She would have wanted to sacrifice her life for her child. So she made the ultimate sacrifice a mother can make. Unfortunately, the stress of having that child caused her to go into a seizure, and it ultimately killed her. So there is a huge impact, a huge burden women take when they're actually having these entities inside of them, and that's why the subject kind of came up about how an actual fetus or a zygote impacts a woman. So, but yeah, that's kind of, I guess, give you a rough idea as to how I feel about that.
So are you suggesting that you would only permit, or do you think, let me put it this way. Let's say a mother's life is not in any sort of known immediate danger whatsoever. As far as she and the doctors can tell, she is in no imminent danger whatsoever, and it's 8 months, do you think she should be able to get an abortion if she chooses?
Yeah. Do I like it? No. Because once I set that stipulation, like I said earlier, if I were to say, you know what, I want to make a campaign that would prevent women at, 6 or 7, 8 month, whatever, uh, I want to prevent them from having abortion. Uh, that opens a door for more legislation for me to say, okay, well, since we're preserving life, we need to make sure that we're preserving the best life. When, we need to make sure that we're preserving the right life. That it's in my idea, it's a slippery slope for the government to kind of take control of people's reproductive rights.
All right. So, in other words, your basic general position is for uh, governmental reasons, for those, for that particular context, abortion, if a woman chooses an abortion, she should be able to get one for any reason she chooses throughout the entire pregnancy period, correct?
Say last part again.
So, given that you're concerned about government overreach and things like that, a woman should be able to get an abortion for any reason she chooses throughout the entire 9 months of pregnancy, correct?
No, for any reason, that's where I also have an issue with, and here's the issue. Um, if if I say that any reason is valid, then that opens the door for any time, any place, anywhere. Which, okay, you have. If I give you full rights, sure, you can do that. Do I think it's responsible? No. So if I don't want government overreach, but I also don't want the let's say, what I'm trying to think of, the McDonald's drive-through abortion, circuit. How can I reconcile that? So I
Well,
say, all right, if you want to use the abortion clinic as just, your birth control, then after the second one, you should be refused service. And so if it's Planned Parenthood, it's whomever, uh, you're just going to have to be forced to take it and then send it to a safe haven place. So there's not an ordinance, not a legal ordinance blocking you. It's just a facility just reserves that right to stop you at that point. And so that way the government hasn't reached in and taken control of that, but your options are simply curved because you're just being denied service.
what
Does
if
that
they
make
don't?
sense?
And what if they don't stop? After the second time, should the personnel who participated be prosecuted?
No, they're doing their job. Their job is to provide medical assistance for the doctor or the physician. The physician's job is to perform these medical services. So if that is happening, then ultimately it's going to be on the individual, because, and I'm not sure how many people know this, when women actually have abortions, it reduces their ability to carry viable fetuses to term. Each and every time. It just compounds that issue. So if you've had a woman who's had 3 or 4 abortions, her chance, especially if she's in her 30s, her chances of having a viable fetus after that is probably less than 30-35%.
So here's the thing. You say that they should not be prosecuted even if they participated in it. Like, she's had one termination, and let's say, I don't know, at 7 months, and then she did another one. She had no life threatening issues whatsoever. She did another one at some time later on at 8 months, but they should not be prosecuted. But if that's the case, then that would suggest to me that although it may inconvenience you, you do not believe that women should be forbidden by the law to have an abortion at any time for any reason they choose.
Well, that's why I'm trying to prevent the government from making any type of regulation. That's because I don't think you should punish mothers who are trying to conduct their reproductive rights. And the mothers that I'm talking about are not the ones that are trying to use it as a McDonald's drive-thru, which, sure, probably, maybe it will even say most of them will be irresponsible and just use it as birth control. But the facilities themselves should institute those regulations, not the government. So I'm not in favor of prosecuting doctors for doing their job, or other women for, you know, having the misfortune of being raped or something like that.
But the thing is, if you do in fact think a woman should not be prosecuted for any reason at any time for having an abortion, then uh, what would be the real difference between her doing it at 8 months as opposed to doing it on a newborn child?
Again,
There's
that
not
goes
much time
there's
between those two phases. Go
so
ahead.
there are huge developmental differences again between the fetus and zygote and the zygote and then the zygote and the neonate, for instance. There are huge differences. So conflating those differences is not going to help you know, suss out what's actually happening there. And again, this goes based on the viability of the potential neonate.
What if, let's say, she was in labor at, like, I don't know, very very late. She was in, uh, she I guess she was going through the motions, but the baby didn't actually come. And then, for whatever reason, before she went into labor, she decided she wanted to get an abortion. Now we don't know what her reasons are for doing such or why she would do that, but I don't think that's relevant to the fact that she's saying, I want to get an abortion now. What's the difference between her getting one at that time and then, if she had a baby a day later, she kills it? What's the real difference?
Well, for one thing, I don't think that scenario is actually real. I'm honestly not familiar with any facility that actually does that. If she's about to give birth and then she decides she wants to abort it, I don't think that's an actual part of any medical protocol to do that.
What I'm saying is, you know, she went through, she had like contractions and things like that, but she didn't actually like deliver a child. What I'm saying is, what if a facility, what if she went to a facility who said that, they would carry out this abortion if she wanted to?
So if she found a clinic that would actually abort the fetus, well, I mean,
Mm-hmm.
it'd be considered a late term abortion technically.
Right. So what I'm saying is, if she was clearly on the verge of delivering a child at some point in the imminent uh, period, what would be the real difference between her doing it like right there and just doing it as soon as and killing the baby as soon as it's born? What's the real difference?
As far as that time frame, there would be little difference, probably a matter of days. But again, that's why I am personally against late term abortions.
But you don't believe they should be prosecuted though. But if they did it, when the child was born, you do think they should be prosecuted, right?
Well, the issue here is that it's not a neonate. If it was not delivered, it doesn't possess personhood. So I can't apply personhood to something that's technically not a person yet. You're asking me
So,
to apply legal standard for something that doesn't match the legal standard.
so your position is it would have to be inside the confines of what the law determines as a person, then, right?
Right. It would have, because you're asking me what I would want legally to happen to them. Well, I can't want anything legally to happen to them if they don't fit the criteria.
Well, I'm not saying like necessarily with the law. Like, what what do you think? So, is your position is you go by what the law says, or do you think she should be able to have that decision whether or not the law says she can? What is your personal position?
My personal position is that she should just go ahead and have an emergency C-section, and then the facility itself take the baby and put it into a safe haven. Because at
Right.
that point, having an abortion would be more cumbersome than actually just doing an emergency C-section. Again, I'm deferring to medical protocols, not what I'd find most pleasing.
But if she did do it that late, your personal position is there should be no law to prosecute her, right?
No, because again, it does not possess the actual personhood. Unless personhood gets extended to, um, uh, you know, one still in the womb, then sure, that it is what it is. But if it's not at that point, I can't say whether or not it's going to be, prosecuted.
So is it your position that the entity has personhood when it's born, or Or are you just looking at the law and saying that's the law's position?
That's the law's position. I can't tell you when personhood is magically imbued upon, a particular fetus.
Okay, so if you don't really know, then what would be the issue if like some law said, we're going to allow people to like kill their kids 10 days inside of 10 days after babies are born? If you can't really define when personhood occurs, then what will be the big deal if like laws start permitting that?
So when I say personhood is imbued, that means still in the womb. Like once it comes out, we know that's the hard line where personhood is actually granted upon fetuses, at least legally.
Yes, legally, but do you? But okay, so you're going back to legal terms here. But what I'm telling you is, if the legal terms was moved to like let's say 10 days, would that be an issue with you?
Yeah,
10 days.
because you actually have there's a bit of a difference here. The actual I say entity is no longer attached to another human being. Like it can't fend for itself, but with assistance, it can actually metabolize its own, whatever's its own nutrients without being physically attached to another human being.
Well, why does physical attachment matter? Because even in the late stages, the entity is dependent upon another person, whether you're talking about the late stages or being a newborn. It's dependent either way.
Being dependent on someone having someone as your ward is one thing, because you can pass off responsibility to someone more fitting. Having something physically attached to you and sucking out nutrients where you're the only one that can do that is a huge difference. That's the difference that I'm drawing.
So let's say there was a situation to where you could not pass it off to another person. Would it be okay for a mother to kill her newborn child then?
No, because I mean there aren't options like that around. That's not realistic. There's always someone to give a child to. That's simply unrealistic.
Well, what I'm getting at is you seem to be suggesting that she can only she's the only reason she's not able to kill the child is because there's someone around. But if there was nobody around, then she would be able to.
Well, no, that my issue is that she's physically attached to the fetus. So if she's physically attached to it by an umbilicus, there is no one that can do that. Are you talking about now a neonate that has to be supplied nutrients, or are you talking about the actual one in the womb?
I'm just talking about the simple concept that you said that if there's someone to give it to, which there usually is, then she can't kill that child. But let's just take that off the table as a thought experiment. So you're suggesting that if she couldn't give it to someone, just as a thought experiment, it would be okay for her to kill a newborn child.
No, it wouldn't be okay, and that's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that let me reiterate what I'm saying. The fact that we are allowing women to terminate is based primarily on the fact that this entity subsists upon her physical being. Like you can't remove her umbilicus and then attach it to a machine. So when we're talking about these rights, it has a lot to do with her body and her entity itself. Now, if we're talking about the termination of something that has been removed from the umbilicus that can be sustained by another person or any other entity, that's dramatically different. Now we've moved outside of her reproductive rights into where this entity is way more autonomous than it previously was.
No, but you're suggesting that there have to be somebody available around so she won't be able to kill her newborn child.
Sure, that shouldn't be an option, because there are other people physically capable of doing it. As long as there's one other human being that exists, or even primates know how to take care of a human child.
So that's the only reason why she cannot make that choice. It's because other people are around.
No, I think so from a moral standpoint that you should allow that child the right to live just as she had been given, sure. But the basis for that is simply based on other moral tenets that I personally hold. But from simply a right to live standpoint, after it has been imbued with personhood, that's why I then say, okay, well, here's where my morals step in.
Well, here's the issue. The reason why um, we we don't kill newborn babies is because there's a level of compassion that humanity has, right?
Sure.
And we're not just going to say that someone's going to be able to just take their newborn child, go in the middle of nowhere, and just leave it there and not be held legally responsible in some way. We're not going to say that that's all right, but that's predicated on the compassion that we have. But the fact of the matter is, laws can change at any time, which says that um, a woman can, do whatever she wants with this newborn, and she should not be prosecuted. Um, if if we were to make laws like that, then it would not matter. But you're saying that that should not even be a law at all when the baby is born. So what I'm trying to figure out is, why do you think that there's some sort of inherent right for the baby to be taken care of by somebody else?
I don't think it's a right. I wouldn't call it a right. I think that because the option exists, and because you are right, we are inclined to view infants with a sort of compassion that we don't have for really anything else. But that's, again, millions of years of evolutionary biology. And so because we have that innate within us, we should use that. That should be readily available.
Mm-hmm. So, so because we have, because we have that sort of compassion, we should not kill newborn babies. But we can have the same compassion for babies that are 1 day away from being born, hypothetically speaking, and we can have laws to prevent that too. But you seem to think there's some sort of difference. I don't understand why you think there's a difference.
Well, I think there is a difference. If I were to show you a chart of some 4-week-old zygotes from different species, I guarantee you wouldn't be able to tell the human apart from the other ones. There's a stark difference between an actual human neonate and an actual zygote, and that's why I was doing the illustrations earlier, to say that we do have an innate need to preserve life as human beings, as Homo sapiens. That is exactly what we have, and I would never deny that. But the issue is that your compassion, and the compassion that I agree with, extends to a certain stage in development. It doesn't exist for all stages.
And that's decided by who?
That's decided by your nature. I could actually show you, again, I could show you a picture of 5 different zygotes, and you wouldn't be able to tell me which one you have compassion, or you don't have a radar to say, you know what, that one, that's not an elephant, that's actually a human. There's no innate way for you to do that unless you've been trained by an embryologist or some sort to actually spot differences in the gill slits or something of that nature.
Well, the thing is, you can say that we have those laws specifically in places like the United States, but you can have a country, and there have been civilizations in the past to where they've allowed the killing of newborn babies.
Mm-hmm.
Because they have different laws and rules and different value judgments and so on and so forth. So would you say the societies that permitted those things were wrong?
I think so. I think they were wrong, just because you shouldn't be just killing kids. But I understand why they did it. I do understand, just like people understand why killing or killing was allowed in the Bible, and that's okay. I also understand that those particularly, say, China, suffering from overpopulation. So if they wanted to finger snap and pull a Thanos, then it is what it is for them. But if they've run out of options, then there's little you can say. Either you allow your society to crash, or you have sacrifices.
But ultimately, what this comes down to is that you think that there's some sort of different, and I don't really understand, like, why literally only 1 day before a child is due, 1 day, you use this scientific criteria to say, oh, now it escapes the womb. Now we should value it. Now we should not have any laws allowing this entity to be killed.
Well, that is what the law is. I'm simply repeating it. Do I think that a day apart within the womb and outside the womb is a big difference? No, developmentally, no. And this is all based on, again, the word that I continuously use, viability. At that stage, the potential neonate is incredibly viable if it's made it that far. And so biologically, there's very, very little difference. But if we're trying to talk about and view personhood from the aspect of law, then yes, outside of the womb is granted that personhood. Inside the womb, it is not, unless you have certain states which have actually extended the personhood range. But if we're talking about this nebulous concept is overall of what being a person is, having the human life being sacrosanct, again, that's nebulous. Like I wouldn't even know where to begin to apply something like that, especially as far as law, especially as far as biology. I don't think anybody has that, and so that's kind of why this whole conversation persists. Do I like late-term abortions? No. Do I like abortion? No, I don't actually. But I do understand that the government cannot be allowed to pry too far into people's lives, because that leaves the room for more disasters. And we've seen what happens when there is too much control, such as the example you gave, where there are certain countries who will actually kill newborns. So in order for us to disallow that evil, we have to make some sacrifice somewhere else.
But why say that the government, um, you know, the government being forbidden for prosecuting a woman from doing it one day before, that's not an issue. But if the government disallows that once the baby is born, then that's not government overreach.
No, again, because there's a difference in personhood.
By whose standards?
By the standards that we set.
By the standards that you think, or by you pointing to the law? Because you just told me that in other cultures you thought that was wrong for them to be killing babies. So your actual moral position can't be the law, right?
No, of course not. My actual moral position would have to do with, again, more along the lines of the viability. That's why I said earlier that the difference between the 1-day-old, neonate versus it being in the womb a day earlier, there's a little difference between them. So again, that's why I said I was against late-term abortions.
So if your actual position isn't predicated on the law, then what could be the real issue with the government allowing babies to be killed 10 days after the fact? What could be the real issue?
Because
Why do you say those governments are wrong for doing that, but the governments aren't wrong for allowing, women to kill even up to one day before they're due?
Let me clarify. Not that they are wrong in the sense that they should not have been doing it. They're wrong because I don't like it. That's why I drew that distinction. I don't like what they did, but I said I understood it. It is what it is, because they did not want their societies to collapse, and that's why I made the Thanos reference. So I do understand what they did. I don't like it personally because we're not preserving life.
But if the law did, say that women can or anyone can kill their newborns 10 days after birth, then whether you liked it or not, there'd be nothing you could do about it. And would you try to stop something like that? If let's say that became the law of our land, like here in the United States, would you want to advocate against that?
I would advocate against it because you have viability. Again, it goes back to viability. Barring SIDS, there's very little that's just going to abruptly happen, to the neonate. So as long as it's taken care of properly. So if there is a law that allows that, I would actually advocate against that. Again, because we have personhood issues that are being violated. If there is a law that preceded that challenged personhood, then I would want it placed back where it is and it possibly explored more, as you no longer have this entity that subsists upon another human being, via umbilicus.
Well, viability is just a measure of medical technology. Like as science and medical technology improve over time the state of improving healthcare for women in pregnancy gestational stages, as that increases, so does the potential for the unborn to live at certain stages. Like um, there was a case of a person who survived at like 21 weeks, 6 days, and as technology improves, so does the potential for the unborn to survive. But here's the thing: we can have a case to where we have artificial wombs. I mean, they're working on that right now.
Oh yeah, I know.
Just about artificial wombs. So that would not just be a case of viability right there at all, because you'll be dealing with fetuses, you
Well,
know, way before the viability state. You see
right.
what I'm saying?
So
So,
the issue with that is, and then you've actually opened up kind of Pandora's box to a few discussions I've had in my molecular genetics course. Um, there, there is a huge. If you think that the issues that we talk about now are kind of messy, you have an issue where who has rights over that? If I am a researcher and I need to terminate these cells, let's say it's just a zygote, um, those cells were provided by other people. Do they have rights to it? Do I have to consult them before I terminate it? You know, if I get a bit of research, you know, do the donors, do the parents actually have rights to any patents that I create? Is there a myriad of issues with that go far beyond the sanctity of human life, and to me, that's kind of another hint that we don't really value human life as much as we claim to value it. I mean, if that were so, I wouldn't be able to have embryonic stem cells in my lab right now.
and would you say that if we get to the point to where we develop these artificial wombs, do you think the choice to abortion, if a woman wants to pursue it, should still be on the table?
That I could not say. We are way, like, I would love to have a separate hangout just hypothesizing about that, because that's a very interesting topic. A few issues arise with that. So let's say, Antonio, I take your sperm cells, right? You have you have good BRCA genes from your mother, and you see you have you know, the potential future, you know, Mrs. Fletcher. She has bad BRCA genes, right? Uh, you want to have a child, and you know what? We have the technology to say it's going to be. Well, you guys want a baby girl. Well, if you want her to live and not have to have a double mastectomy or breast cancer, you're going to say, hey, can y'all do something to make sure that she has my good BRCA genes? So we can then use technology, maybe CRISPR technology, and make sure that your genes are inherited instead of your wife's. Now, this process is still experimental. We want to patent it, but something goes awry. We need to start over. And you guys get consulted. You say, hey, Mr. and Mrs. Fletcher, we need to terminate. We have a problem. As it looks, CRISPR's gone haywire. It looks like they've, had a chromosomes. Excuse me. There you go. Your X chromosomes got duplicated. They got a bar body, so it's going to be, X X X. No, no, no. We want it. Well, hold on for a second. We've been working on this. We actually have legal rights to this. Well, it's our cells. So the question is, should they be allowed to reimplant the cells in Mrs. Fletcher, or be allowed to terminate it? Because it technically does belong to both parties, even though the donor, it obviously belongs to them, but legally, they were signed over to researchers. So like I could literally talk about this topic for an hour and a half.
I want to discuss something you brought up with Jesus is Lord, like when you mentioned the whole deal about like an oak is not a tree. Yeah, I just want to like just press you on what you was talking about with there. Like,
Sure.
why did you bring that analogy up specifically? Like, what was your goal behind bringing that up?
I use that analogy because, and oftentimes, there in these conversations, people end up saying killing babies, and the killing
Hmm.
babies has a kind of a visceral tone to it that doesn't actually reflect the medical termination of a zygote or a fetus. And so pointing out that there's a huge difference in the development of this entity versus this entity, and that they are actually separate, even though they contain the same DNA, they are actually separate entities, um, susses out exactly what's going on rather than using loose language to try and invoke, an emotional response out of people.
Well, loose language. I mean, don't you think it's kind of loose alone that people just sort of just throw out fetus, just kind of just throw that out there? Because a lot, in my experience, a lot of pro-choicers. I mean, I call them pro-aborts, but they call themselves pro-choicers. But whatever, they just kind of just throw that out there and don't really think through what they're actually talking about. I think when you talk about certain terms, I think how these terms are applied are the importance or the pertinent issue rather than the terms themselves.
I would agree with you to a certain respect. People should use the right terms in the right context. I am. That's why you see me making sure that what I'm saying is very clear when I reference a neonate versus a zygote versus a fetus versus whatever. Uh, they have those labels and those designations for a reason, and that's why I kept mentioning viability as a unifier between them. So when there are people who are on the pro-life side, and I've seen them, I know Nadia is that's where I got my my illustration of the McDonald's drive-through of abortion. That's what she was for. I'm not for that. So if there are people who are just saying, what, give women the right to do whatever, I can't say I agree with them, because I think that there is some personal responsibility that needs to be had, and that just allowing people to do whatever, hasn't really worked out in all cases, but the restrictions can be applied so that most parties are happy.
Well, when you said that, like, an oak is not a tree, and I think uh, if an oak, like an no, you said like an
Acorn.
acorn. Yeah, an acorn is not a tree. But here's the issue: is an acorn oak? And the answer to that is yes. It's in the Quercus genus, I believe, and oak is in, right?
I'm not into plant science, so I'll just say yes for the argument's sake.
Yeah, yeah. If I remember correctly, an oak is part of the Quercus genus. So, um, and an acorn is an oak, just like a tree is an oak. And I think in that same
Hmm.
vein, a fetus is a human, just like an adult is a human. So I think the question
Hmm.
is not is um not is an acorn a tree, because I mean you could say that a toddler is not an adult, a teenager is not a senior citizen, a baby is not a 3-month old toddler. So what?
So when I'm using the word tree, I'm distinguishing its physical structure and its stage in development. I could have just easily have said a sapling is not a tree. Again, to point out the difference in development. And again, that's just to highlight the differences and between the stages of development between a potential neonate and an actual child.
But yeah, I mean, there's just developmental differences, but we're not going to say that a newborn baby is not an adult. And both of you, you and I would both agree that there should be no laws killing newborn babies just arbitrarily.
Right.
We're not going to say, oh, a baby is not an adult, and a baby can't do or contribute in the ways an adult can. So, killing a newborn baby is fine. I think that's what you were doing. It's just you were just looking at how the developmental stages are and how they function, just saying that the lesser stage is different than the later stage, and just predicating that with an argument.
Well, they are different. I mean, we can't ignore the differences because we don't like it. There is a huge difference between a group of cells that could potentially become a more advanced stage of cells that could potentially become a human being at some point an actual like toddler human. So, I mean, we can't just ignore those differences and pretend they're not there.
Well, different in development, but so what? Again, like a newborn baby is different than an adult, but we don't just look at different developmental stages to say we can just kill newborns. So
Oh,
what?
we actually do look at those differences, especially when it comes to the law. That's why we have laws precluding certain people of certain developmental stages from doing certain things. I mean, that exists at every aspect of our legal system. But for some reason, like the unborn is supposed to be exempt from that.
If we're talking about killing
And
humans, we don't. If we're talking about just arbitrarily killing humans, right? Just unjustly, like we don't sit up here and say, "Oh, the development of a baby is different than an adult." Therefore, because we look at that as a developmental difference, it's okay to kill babies.
well, we
That's not
find it.
how we. That's not how
Mhm.
we um, look at things or adjudicate things. That's not how we do it in
That
our
is how we do
system.
it. Actually, that is exactly how we do it. When we say that a juvenile commits a crime, an adult can commit the same type of crime and get killed for that, but the juvenile won't. We make differences in the law all the time when it comes to that. I mean, Louisiana is a good example of that moving over into juveniles now being considered adults because they want to be tougher on crime. But interestingly enough, that had to be moved because we distinguished that developmental difference. So that exact thing does exist legally.
Well, what you're doing right there is you're conflating accountability with human nature. I mean, I think that's the difference between the nature of a newborn child and an adult. We're talking about human nature right there. You're just talking about accountability, in different stages of life. I think those are two different things that don't belong in the same context.
Well, sure. If we're gonna point out that difference, then we have to also acknowledge the differences that I pointed out earlier as far as the law goes. We can't choose to look at differences and not acknowledge them in my case, but then now we're going to look at the differences in your case and now use that as an exclusion criteria for comparison.
Well, I'm not looking at differences to decide, who gets to live and die. And that's not what I'm doing here because
That's
I
part of the
think
problem.
no matter, what stage of development you're in, you should not be killed unjustly, especially without due process of law.
I
That's
don't
what
know
I'm
what
talking about.
I mean. I'm not sure what we mean unjustly. I mean, it's if who gets to decide that. I mean, if that's unjust. So we know that as far as adults, sure, we can have laws, and if you violate those laws, a decision can be made. But then, even with that, what's taken into account is the stage of development. So that it goes right back to the thing that I mentioned at the beginning, where we look at the viability of this particular entity when we're making these decisions, legal or not.
Like, for example, like you said that just the McDonald's abortions, you would think those are unjust, right?
Yeah, I do because they aren't actual. They aren't actual means to an end. If the idea is to not get pregnant, then that is not a solution for that particular problem. Then we need more robust birth control.
So, if we take time to really iron out these issues, we can come to certain agreements on what's
Sure.
just and unjust. And um, I think the same sort of reasoning that you're applying and saying, this human is different than this one at this stage, therefore you can, do these things to this human given this. That's the same sort of thing that, they did with blacks when they were enslaved by the Europeans. That's the same sort of thing that Hitler did when he was saying that the Jews were not as valuable as these other races he valued.
Mhm.
That's the same sort of thing that you're doing. All you're doing is just applying it to the unborn.
I mean, I had to laugh at Godwin's law, but it's interesting because what I'm applying are I'm acknowledging, I should say that the differences that exist. Looking at those differences and acknowledging them for what they are is not a crime because again we do it legally and we do it in biology and there's a reason why these differences exist. Pretending they don't exist does not make anyone's argument better for anything.
Well, that it's not about just the mere fact of acknowledging differences for what they are. Like we can acknowledge differences between you and I, but that doesn't mean I could just go up to you and just kill you for no reason.
Sure, and I would definitely agree with that. But if I do something to you, then the law says, you know what, I forfeited my my chance to live in this society, and now they're going to take my life as compensation. But if I were a juvenile, that same instance doesn't exist. I would be put away for X amount of years instead of being killed. So again, we still there's a difference here that is highlighted, that is carried out. And so for some reason, if that difference exists, there shouldn't be the same apply to, any other stage in development.
But you
I'm
just
not sure how
point,
that works.
but you just point to the law when you said that. You said the law says this, but you threw out the law when you said like, societies that were killing newborns. You thought the law permitting that was a bad thing. So why do you appeal to the law in this instance, but you throw it out when you think it's bad for them to kill newborn babies?
Again, I didn't throw it out. I drew a distinction between what I personally like and what reality is and what the law is. And that's why I had to keep like reiterating that. What I personally like is different than what is legal. And that what I personally like aligns with, of course, my moral framework and what have you. Yet I understood when we had the example of China, where they had to kill off, I think it was the baby girls or something like that, if they were born to a family in order to prevent overpopulation. So again, and I said, it is what it is.
What I'm getting at is every in particular situations, like you said earlier, that if the law changed, like for whatever reason, to allow people to kill unborn babies, newborn babies, 10 days after they're born, you would advocate against that,
Yep.
right? So what I'm getting at is when you have a particular moral issue with the law, you would advocate against that law. And that's exactly what pro-lifers are doing when they're saying this is a moral problem when you killing these unborn children.
Sure.
So
And I understand it.
you're acting in the same principle on if they were to change the laws, pro-lifers are acting right now.
Sure, and I definitely understand their need to feel that way. Unfortunately, they end up conflating zygotes and fetuses and neonates, which they use I guess, fuel the fervor behind this movement. And so
Now
I think it's a gross misunderstanding of human nature and human development that kind of drives that, which is a huge difference than having an fairly autonomous being that can subsist with the assistance of someone else and is not, required to, by an umbilicus. And again, there's a huge difference between those two scenarios.
but this is crazy because you're looking at this autonomous agent, and you seem to presume that because an agent is autonomous, like a newborn baby, that it should have some sort of right to be taken care of by somebody. But I thought you said earlier that you don't think a newborn baby has a right to be taken care of by anyone.
So the newborn should be able to be taken care of by whoever is available, and there's plenty of people who are available. It is not physically attached to anyone, so that option now exists. While it's attached to the mother, that option does not exist. We don't have the technology for that. If we get the technology for it, then sure. If a woman doesn't want a fetus, I say, you know what, they can have a third elective surgery, which is a removal, and the fetus will be, or zygote, whatever it is at that stage, will be placed into a medical facility. Hopefully by then we'll have universal health care. And then it can be put into a family that loves it. Sure, in an ideal world, I would love that. But that simply doesn't exist at this point. So,
But you're saying an autonomous entity like a baby should morally have the right to be taken care of by somebody else, right?
in an ideal world, sure. But that that option exists in a lot of cases via a lot of laws that put in place by safe haven groups such as the ones you mentioned. So since those exist, we should use them as an option.
Well, who says we should use them at all? Who says we should?
I'm not saying that anybody should. I would hope via evolutionary biology that people would be naturally inclined to do so. But I'm not going to expect everyone to do that.
So what it basically comes down to is you have I mean, we all have our opinions, but I think there's a big difference between you're pointing out all these differences and using those as justifications to kill the unborn. And me saying, look, I don't care what our differences are. You shouldn't go around just arbitrarily killing someone just because you have a personal opinion about it.
Well, we use these differences all the time in medicine. That's why we have personalized medicine. Like you can't use like, personalization to use that as a guide in medical interventions and then say, well, for this in one instance, this medical intervention, we're not going to do that. We're because it makes me feel a type of way. That makes no sense. That goes against everything that we're trying to accomplish in medical research.
But you're talking about how something would make you feel, and and just because something should make you feel a certain way, it don't mean anything. But you just told me that if the law were to change, you would feel that it was wrong for the law to allow babies to be killed 10 days after they are born. So you would act on your feelings in that regard, wouldn't you?
Yeah, and as far as the legal statute, not again, I made a reference to medical interventions and medical science. That wasn't a reference to my legal stance. They are separate from one another. And so when I step into my role as a scientist in training or a junior scientist, I have to acknowledge biology for what it is, sans my feelings. When I'm looking at things from a legal standpoint, I have to remove my feelings from that. But if we're talking about how it can impact society, of course, I'm going to defer to my moral framework.
Oh, so in other words, pro-lifers aren't necessarily, acting on their feelings to change the legal status.
Oh no, they are. They exactly are. And I'm not saying that you shouldn't, but for me personally, I have certain degrees of separation that I have from that. What I feel may be the case may not be the best legally. So I have to remove that before I start making decisions on that. And I don't think pro-lifers tend to be able to do that very well. I think it's actually a lot of it's fueled by simply emotion and not a lot of robust understanding of the law or medical science.
Well, I mean, I think that's crazy that you would say that they're fueled by emotion because, I mean, you talked about like stuff like financial cases, emotional cases, to where you think a woman may not be able to take care of a child. It seems like you and a lot of other pro-choicers, bring up emotional stuff all the time. So,
Sure. Sure. And it definitely fuels people's decision to have the abortion. But what should end up happening is that they should get counseling. Like, again, in the state of Louisiana, you're required to have a counseling session to see if you actually want to do this, which I am all for. I'm not
mhm.
for the ones that try to coerce women to carry it to term and then just give it up. But if that is something that they're just going through a temporary depression, they just need a certain type of medication, then sure. But it is integral to understand that because someone feels a certain type of way, they should try to mitigate that emotion so that they can think rationally instead of reacting purely on emotion.
Hey, give me just a second. I want to continue with this just for a few more minutes. I'm going to drop out, but I'm going to come back in on my phone.
Okay.
All
Yeah,
right.
I got a few more minutes.
All right.